Hey there everybody, and thanks for joining me. In this demo, we're going to take a quick walkthrough of a couple of different ways that you can access Azure Active Directory. We'll take a look at an existing Azure AD tenant and see how it is related to an Azure subscription, and I'll also show you some other portals as well as where you might go if you want to set up your own Azure AD tenant. Now, you don't have to set up your Azure AD tenant right now because we're going to do so in another lesson where we get started setting up our Azure subscription. So first things first, what I want to do is point out that I'm logged into the Azure portal using the portal.azure.com interface. Now this interface, even though it is used for managing Azure resources, also provides access to manage Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to click on the Azure Active Directory option here, and we can see here the configuration of my AussieMart Azure AD tenant. Now, when I logged into portal.azure.com, I did so using a user account that exists within this tenant. So we can see all of the different user accounts that I have here right now. So this is what we were speaking about within the lesson. The fact that we have this Azure Active Directory tenant, it contains all of the user and identity and other sorts of information related to identity and access management. And it's these identities that we actually use to go and access my Azure subscription. So what I'm going to do is just browse back to home, and I'm going to show you that I have Azure subscriptions already set up. So I'll click on subscriptions, and you can see I've got 2 subscriptions here ready to go. Now, we haven't yet spoken about how to set up these subscriptions, and we will in an upcoming lesson and demonstration, but we do know that Azure Active Directory can be associated to subscriptions that we want to manage. So if I take a look at my production subscription, for example, really importantly, I can see here that the directory for the subscription is the AussieMart tenant that I am logged into. Now, if I take a look at my development subscription, I can see exactly the same thing. So yes, we can have one Azure AD tenant used for multiple different subscriptions. You can't have one subscription belong to multiple tenants, and one subscription does always have to be associated with one tenant. But I also said that we can use Azure Active Directory for things other than Azure. So for that reason, you'll find that there are other portals that you can use to go and manage your Azure Active Directory tenant. So for example, if I open up a new window and I navigate into entra.microsoft.com, okay, what we can see here is that we've got a different experience for just managing my Azure Active Directory and other Microsoft identity related features. So for example, once again, I could browse on the left-hand side to users, and I can see that I've got all of those same users that we were just looking at a moment ago. Now, really importantly for my Azure AD tenant, one thing that we should know is if I expand out the Show More option on the left-hand side and I choose Settings, and then I browse into Domain Names, you'll see that for my Azure Active Directory tenant, I actually have 2 domain names. I have one custom domain that I have set up using my own DNS provider, aussiemart.com. But I also have this on Microsoft.com address here. Now this address, anything.onmicrosoft.com, is a domain that you will always have. It is the first domain that is set up when you set up your Azure AD tenant. So what's going to happen in the upcoming lesson where we get started configuring our own Azure subscription is this tenant is going to be created for us. And I'm just going to call out now that depending on the email address you actually use to sign up for your Azure subscription, okay, this tenant name might look a little bit funny, and we'll see that in an upcoming demonstration. So when you do configure your Azure AD tenant, if you want to have control over the domain name that you use here, then what you might actually choose to do is go ahead and set up your Azure AD tenant first. Now, if we set up a free Azure subscription, that can be a little bit hard because all of that is taken care of by the wizard that we use to set up our Azure subscription. So if you do want control over that name, or if you're not even working with an Azure subscription and you just want to set up an Azure AD tenant and have it all configured, maybe for use with something like Microsoft 365, then what I would recommend that you do is actually get started setting up that tenant first. And really the easiest way to do so can be through the setup of a Microsoft 365 subscription. So what you might like to do is navigate to this link, and I'll include it within the description for this video below. You can go ahead, you can choose to sign up for a free Microsoft 365 trial. Now, Microsoft 365 includes a range of software for email, file sharing, and much, much more. You'll get access to features like Exchange Online, Teams, SharePoint, and a range of other collaboration tools. So if you do want to set up this tenant first, this can be a good way to go ahead, get started, try it out for free, get your Azure Active Directory tenant set up, and if you're not going to use any of these other features, then you can cancel that subscription. Even if you cancel this subscription, if you've gone ahead and set up an Azure subscription, your Azure AD tenant will still be there ready for your use. Now, one last thing that I do want to call out is if we browse back to the Azure portal and I go to Home and we navigate into the Azure Active Directory tenant once again, you'll also see here that the license I'm using for my Azure Active Directory tenant is free. Now, there are a range of different Azure AD features for securing identities, improving self-service, and much, much more. And if you want to get access to those and trial them out, what you can do is you can choose to go to the licenses section on the left-hand side, navigate to all products, and you can actually then click on try/buy. And Microsoft does include some free trials for you to try out those other additional identity features. So really the key point that I'm hoping you'll understand as we explore Azure Active Directory through this demonstration is that Azure Active Directory and your Azure AD tenant is entirely separate to your Microsoft 365 subscription or your Azure subscription. You could just go ahead, set up an Azure AD tenant, load up some pretend user accounts, and you could try out all of these different identity security features without even really using Microsoft 365 or even the Azure portal. However, the purpose of this Getting Started course is to explore Azure, so what we're going to do in an upcoming lesson is get started with your Azure subscription, and we'll create an Azure Active Directory tenant as well. Okay, everybody, so that's a wrap for this demonstration. You've seen there's a few different ways we can manage our Azure Active Directory tenant. If you like, you can go ahead and get started with a free trial, set up your own Azure Active Directory tenant right now, and you can even choose to use that in the upcoming demonstration where we set up our subscription. But if you don't want to do that right now, that's perfectly okay, because in the upcoming demonstration, we're going to set up a new subscription and a tenant all at once. Thanks once again for joining me, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it, and that's a wrap.